Welcome. I want to tell you about my favorite books of 2024 and why I think you should read them in 2025. So this is my first video, and I think that telling you about my favorite books that I read last year will give you a good sense of the types of books I like to read, the types of books that I'll recommend to you, how I talk about them, what they mean to me, and so you can kind of just get a sense of what this page will sort of be like. I want to talk about books, I want to talk about my favorite things, I want to do vlogs, but for now, just as an introductory video, let's talk about the best books I read in 2024. So coming in at number 10, we have Greta and Valdin by Rebecca K. Reilly. This is a book that I think actually came out in 2024. It's kind of a sleeper hit for me. It was really excellent, and I've recommended it to a lot of friends because I think it's a type of book that a lot of people might need right now. It tells the story of Greta and Valdin. They're siblings, they're Russian, Maori, and they live in New Zealand. And they're kind of in their mid to late 20s, early 30s, and they're just lost and a bit listless and trying to figure out their lives. Greta has a girl that she's in love with, but it's not reciprocated. And Greta kind of like puts herself in positions that she doesn't really want to be in order to get closer to this girl. And this girl's like not interested at all. I think we've all been in a situation where we've kind of put ourselves in a place that we don't really want to be in for whatever circumstance. It can be related to your job or your family or friends or relationships. And Greta's story is about sort of like overcoming that, finding what's important to her, and really sort of showing up for herself in a new way. Valdin, her brother, is a bit of a mess, but is really interesting and really lovable. So he's kind of gone through a career change. He's now like a TV personality, which is a little bit strange, but it's kind of understandable once you get to know his character. And he's really hung up on his ex, who now lives in Argentina. Well, one day he finds out that his job is going to go do a story in Argentina, and he's like kind of freaking out, not sure if he wants to go, kind of brings up old feelings, overwrought feelings about his ex and just like how things ended, and just like so many things about his life and like why he became this TV personality in general. I think these characters feel really real, they're really entertaining, they're really sweet, and something that I really loved about this book is there's a really interesting family dynamic going on. It's very modern, it's very mixed personalities, mixed backgrounds, mixed histories. It's very interesting and fascinating, and I think a lot of us might have families now that are kind of like different than what is traditional, and there's a lot of love in this family, and that's something I really appreciated. So this is an easy book for me to recommend. I really enjoyed it, and I think it's gonna have wide appeal. It's a great book if you're sort of like getting into literary fiction, you're dipping your toe into more contemporary literary fiction. If you're sort of like a genre reader, this is a great book. I think that will appeal to a lot of people, so highly recommend it. Ninth place, we have The Secret History by Donna Tartt, and this was a really interesting book to read because it's so popular online. And so it was kind of like a practice of learning how to read popular books and learning how to separate expectations and go into books without that weight of what you think it might be. Now, I admit that was kind of difficult, but I tried to like stay away from anything I saw about this book because I don't know, I kept seeing like it's dark academia, and I don't really know what that means. I just know that it takes place at a university. I think that sort of naming of this book is a little bit reductive, and it doesn't really give the book a fair shot to stand on its own and to really let you come up with your own opinions. So this was actually one of the first books that I annotated. I've been thinking a lot about how to connect to books more. And I talked to some of my friends who read, some of my friends who annotate, and they told me that that's a good way to sort of come back to things. And as I've gotten more into like literary analysis and criticism, I think annotation is something that's really helped me gather my thoughts, notice themes in books, and read in a way that feels sometimes more connected. Now, I don't always want to annotate because sometimes you just like want to turn the page and like not have to write everything down. I'm not a highlighter. I don't write in the books, but I do tab. So this is a book about essentially some really pretentious college students. They go to a small New England college, and they are all students of this enigmatic professor who only takes on a certain number of students per year or no students per year. He teaches classics, and all of the 5 main characters are sort of as you would expect. They wear suits to class, they have a chip on their shoulder, they speak in Greek to each other, and they generally think that they're better than everyone else. They host elaborate dinner parties. It's very much the more pretentious version of something like Perks of Being a Wallflower, in terms of like, we're this like unique sort of group. Yeah, I definitely had some kids like this at my high school, and now I'm like wondering if they read this book. That would make a lot of sense. They wore tweed suits to school, and I live in Los Angeles. There's never a need to wear tweed suits. Anyways, I digress. What is interesting about this book is, like I said, a lot of people read into it as like this dark academia campus novel. And while there are elements of that, I think that sometimes people are missing a large part of the story, and that this is a modern Greek tragedy. It follows similar themes, it follows a similar structure, definitely in the second half of the book. The first half of the book, you're getting introduced to the characters, the story's getting set up, but the second half of the book is full on Greek tragedy. And what I mean by that is each character has a fatal flaw that comes back to haunt them, that reappears in their life, that sort of like tortures them in a way that almost feels a bit validating because they're not that good people. Now, I'm not saying they deserve punishment, but they do some pretty awful things in this book. And I think that if you look at it through that lens of modern Greek tragedy, it becomes really interesting. It becomes really fun as you see the characters sort of flesh out these archetypes. So I actually really loved this book, and I think it's great. I think it deserves its popularity, definitely. But if you're going to read it, go into it as blind as you can. Like, try not to look anything up except for what I told you. And I think that you'll have a really good experience. 8th place, we have Annihilation by VanderMeer. And I'm not that big of a sci-fi reader, not for any particular reason. I just haven't found many sci-fi books that have really totally appealed to my interests. But I've seen the movie for Annihilation. I think I saw it maybe early on in the pandemic lockdown, and I loved it. I love Alex Garland. He's a wonderful director. He directed Ex Machina and Civil War, which came out recently, and a few other movies that I think are all worth watching. But this book I thought was going to be just like the movie, but it's not really at all. It kind of tells its own story, and I think the story of the book is better, which, you know, that's pretty frequent. Things happen like that. But I think that they tell their own unique stories, and that's really interesting. So if you've seen the movie already, I think you should pick up the book because they stand on their own. Now, this is a story about 4 women who enter into this mysterious Area X. We don't know too much about what's going on here. We're kind of just thrust into the story, and then you go, and it almost feels like walking down a staircase where there's darkness and you're not sure what's around any corner, but you feel like this draw, like you're very compelled to keep going. That's what reading this book feels like for me. And it's the first in a series of 4. I think that the 4th one just came out this past October 2024. And I think there was a long break. So I've heard that the tone of the first one is a bit different than the others in this series, but I loved this book. I actually read it in 2 sittings. It's not too long. It's like 200 pages, but it moves really fast, and it's a great sci-fi novel. There's interesting elements to bureaucracy a bit, some criticism of bureaucracy, and some maybe quasi-environmental climate change commentary. Even if you're not looking for that, this book is great. It's super entertaining, and I highly recommend it. It's kind of like a good palate cleanser as well. I'm definitely going to continue on with the series. I just have so many books that I want to read that this one finished. Like, you don't have to read every book in the series from what I've seen so far. But this one, highly recommend. I think you should read it. So in 7th place, we have The Vegetarian by Han Kang. And I've been wanting to read this book for a while. I admit that it was just because the name is The Vegetarian, and I'm a vegetarian. I didn't really know what the book was about. But I kind of started to get a sense of what the book was about after Han Kang won the Nobel Prize, which is incredible, and I was really compelled to read this book because of that. So Vegetarian is a really intense, interesting, great story. It's not going to be for everyone. It's pretty intense. So if you aren't feeling in a place to read it, I don't think you have to read it. But I do think it's a pretty necessary read for people who can stomach it. The Vegetarian is a story told in 3 parts. It's a story about a woman who decides one day to become vegetarian. And each part is told from a different member sort of her family. The first part is from her husband's perspective, and he's literally horrible. He was horrible before. He's part of the reason that she maybe like felt the need to become vegetarian. He can't accept it. He abuses her. He's awful. He's evil. We hate him. And part 1 sort of leads us into part 2, which is about her brother-in-law. Now, her brother-in-law becomes sort of obsessed with a birthmark on the main character, and he's an artist, and he sort of uses that lens to justify his obsession, and he acts out these fantasies under the guise of art. Now, it's super inappropriate, it's super evil, it's super just kind of horrifying, and as part 2 concludes, we see the perspective of her sister. This part I found to be my favorite because it's a lot about her sister thinking about why her sister has become vegetarian. Why won't she just eat? Why won't she just sort of conform to society? Her older sister who's taking care of her is thinking like, I'm playing the part. I'm like, acting as a woman should. And we sort of realize that when the younger sister, the vegetarian, rejects society, her older sister is almost a mirror of her. It's almost like as if the 2 sisters had 2 paths in their life, and one was conformity and one was total, complete rejection of society. And those are the 2 characteristics the 2 sisters embody. This book's really brilliant, and it's upsetting and it's sad, but I think it's a book that you'll definitely want to read in time when you're feeling able. The Safekeep by Yeal Wouden was shortlisted for the Booker Prize this year, and I would actually put it at second. I think the Booker should have gone to James by Percival Everett, but this was the second book in the Booker Prize shortlist that I really, truly loved. It tells a story about a woman named Isabel, and she lives in her late mother's house, sort of polishing every dish, polishing every silverware, and really just like resigning her life to remaining in this house. She has 2 older brothers. One of them has gone away with his boyfriend, and then the other is sort of reappearing in the beginning of the story with a new girlfriend. Now, Isabel does not like the new girlfriend, Eva, but her older brother has to leave one day. And so he says, listen, Eva's gonna come stay with you. The house is actually left in my name, and you just kind of have to deal with it. Isabel hates it, and she's a bit obsessed with Eva. She thinks she's stealing something. She thinks she's hiding something, and her obsession sort of turns into fascination and compassion and passion. And the 2 women begin a relationship. The book kind of follows like a fairly linear story for the first 2 parts, but there was some weirdness in the second part that I was like, oh, that's interesting, and I kind of like logged it in my mind. The end of part 2 is amazing and completely elevates the book and pushes it into a new area and makes it something that is really, really worth reading. I think that it recontextualized the whole story, and it made me want to read it again with that new, fresh knowledge, and wow, it really impressed me. I read this book sort of when I was feeling kind of in a reading slump and not really having the attention to read, and this kind of brought me back. So I have a soft spot in my heart for this book. I really, really loved it. I think it's a great new release from last year, and I think it's a debut author, so I'm really excited to see what this author comes up with for their next book. In 5th place, we have Notes of a Crocodile by Maiojin, and I feel like a lot of these books on my list are about the experience that I had reading them. Like, that's why they're here. So when I first started reading this book, it was a Sunday, it was afternoon, I had work the next day, and I was just feeling like I can't get into it. I struggled a lot with the first probably like 70 pages of this book, and it wasn't clicking for me, but I brought it around with me. And one day at lunch, on my lunch break, I was sitting outside, and it was like a really nice temperate day, and the sun was shining just right. And I put on my headphones. I listened to this album called Playing Piano for Dad by H. Hunt. And everything aligned. I was able to completely sink into the book. I was able to feel the emotions that the characters were feeling. I was able to fully just like have the world fade around me. And it ended up being such a beautiful experience, and it made my top 5. Like, I really loved my experience reading this book. So basically the story is told in 8 notebooks. It's about a woman who is in her, I believe, like early 20s. She's in college, and it's in the late 80s and early 90s in Taiwan. She and her band of misfit friends are kind of just like crashing out. They really just are destructive in their relationships, self-destructive, and also just like choosing the wrong people that aren't good for them. And this book is full of so much longing. It really feels like when you're at your lowest and you go to your notes app and you just like let it all out, free of judgment, and just share your true feelings. That's what this book feels like. So it reads really honest. It reads really like intense at your worst moments. So those 8 notebooks are sort of like told chronologically, and they're messy and they're sad and they're full of so much longing. And then there's a dual narrative, and it's about a crocodile in Taiwan. And the crocodile is sort of like sensational, and people think that they are, I don't know, strange, and they're following them, and the crocodile goes to other crocodile clubs. And basically it's just like a metaphor for being queer in Taiwan in the late 1990s, and late 1980s. And I think that it's quite sad. Maiojin has only written 2 books as far as I'm aware, and I think that this book is amazing. It actually started a movement in Taiwan, and some queer people still refer to themselves as crocodiles. So I really loved this book. Anything from NYRB I'm probably going to be interested in and love. So some of the next books on my list are also NYRB classics. All the Lovers in the Night by Meiko Kawakami is number 4. And I can recognize this is not going to be a book for everybody. Now, I have a really hopeful look on this book, and it's because of something that I went through personally. So basically, this tells the story of Fuyuko Ire, and she's in her 30s, and she's kind of like not sure what she wants to do with her life. She's pretty depressed, and she's a copywriter by day. And her only really reprieve from like her kind of torturous, unhappy life is going out on her birthday, which is Christmas Eve, and looking at all the lights. She's a really lonely person. She struggles to connect with people. We find out sort of why that happens, and it's difficult. But she decides one day to go take an adult class. She sort of like wants to maybe make changes in her life, but she is drinking a lot, and she ends up passing out and not able to sign up for this class. But she does meet a stranger who sort of sparks a change within her. Now, I really connected to this book because when I was in my early 20s, I moved to London, and I only knew one person in the entire country, and we had just broken up the week before I moved there. That's tough. London's tough regardless. Moving to a new city where you don't know anyone is tough. Moving to a new city where you do know people is tough. But moving to a new country, even though they're speaking English, like, is still, really far away, and the time zones were different. London can be really depressing and really amazing. It was really gray. There was no sun. Oh my God, I was struggling. So I felt really just kind of like depressed and lonely and just really struggling. And I ended up going home for the holidays back to LA, and I saw my friends, and they kind of encouraged me to try it again, and they were there for me even though they weren't physically there. And so when I went back one night, I was really jet lagged, and I was staying in bed, and I slept I think like all day because I was just so confused because there's no sun. And I decided to go out, and I met some people, and it felt like they lit a candle in me, and I felt like a little bit of warmth. And then a couple weeks later, they invited me on a trip with them, and that candle sort of turned into like a fire, a warming fire. For the course of the months, I kind of felt warm again. I felt like myself again. And so sometimes all you need is somebody to acknowledge you. And the change really comes from within. So I loved this book, and I think it's wonderful. It has a special place in my heart, and I think if you've ever been lonely and maybe you're feeling a bit better, this is a great book to read. Number 3, Chess Story by Stefan Zweig. I'm obsessed with this book. I read it in one day, in one sitting, and I'm fascinated by it. I am convinced of Stefan Zweig's writing abilities, and I want to read everything that he's ever written because I loved this book so much. The story takes place on a ship, and there's an international chess champion aboard. All of the men on the ship want to defeat this chess champion and sort of like put him in his place, I guess. So somebody's playing him, and a mysterious stranger calls out a move that actually makes the layman tie the chess champion. Our sort of like main narrator goes and asks him like, hey, can you play this guy? We want to see if you can beat him. Like, where'd you learn how to play chess? Like, how are you so good? And the mysterious stranger recounts the reason that he's so good at chess, and it's unbelievable. There's so much to the story, and it's so short. It's really amazing and a really fascinating example of like excellence in prose, because the writing's really beautiful, but it's concise and it's smart, and it's just like, oh, it's such a good story. I'm obsessed with this story. It's about obsession, and it's about power and control, and I have chills. I love this book. I'm gonna reread it because I loved it so much. Number 2, we have The Door. And what did I say about the NYRB classics? Like, I really find books that are just like unbelievable that I didn't hear of growing up, and like some people are talking about now, but like in my circles growing up, we were not reading The Door. Like, we were not reading these types of books, but I hope I can convince you. The Door by Magda Szabo is truly an incredible book. It's number 2 for me of the year, and I think that it's going to be one of my favorites. It's such a fascinating story because, wow, it does a lot. So basically it tells a story of Magda, and she's a writer, and she hires Emerence, who's like a neighborhood fixture. She sweeps the snow off everyone's roof and off their porch, and everyone sort of knows her, but she's a little bit wild. And the relationship of these two women is adversarial. They are not always fans of each other. Sometimes Emerence is like straight up mean to Magda, and I don't know. It's interesting. Like, you don't really like Emerence at first, but there's so much to Emerence. Like, the reason she is the way she is, there's so much like historical context to this book. Magda Szabo is a Hungarian writer who was alive during the war, and Hungary has a really interesting history. And I think if you familiarize yourself a bit with the history, it can enhance your reading experience with this book. This book is really a story about how the people that are closest to us can sometimes hurt us the most. And it's fantastic. You should definitely read it. So I'm aware there are 4 books in my hand. This is one story, and we're going to treat it as such, okay? This is the Neapolitan Quartet by Elena Ferrante. And I read these over the summer, and I have not been the same. Like, I am completely changed after reading it. And I think that any book that when you finish the final page, you find yourself a bit different is a masterpiece. Whether it's for better or for worse, if it's something that can impact you in that way, it is worth reading. First up is My Brilliant Friend. And this is probably the one that you've heard of the most. It was just ranked as number 1 best book of the 20th century by the New York Times. I agree because I look at the books in one. I actually think this is the weakest of the series, but it's really foundational. So it sets you up. The main characters are Elena and Lila, and they're 2 friends. They're living in post-war Naples and sort of like a poor community, but a community nonetheless. There are many characters in the story, lots of families that come up and leave and, you know, move away throughout this story. If you've ever had like a really close friend that maybe you're a little bit fascinated by, maybe you're a little bit scared by, maybe you're a little intimidated by, maybe you were a little bit jealous and envious of them, then this book is for you. Elena and Lila are really interesting friends. They love each other more than anything, but the way that they interact is not always healthy, but it's really real. I think that Elena Ferrante is really good at saying the quiet parts out loud, and I was able to like recount memories that I had in my childhood that I haven't thought of in years. So this is amazing. Second book in the series, and this is really where I became obsessed. It's called The Story of a New Name. We see Elena and Lila, and they're in their early adulthood, and Elena goes to school while Lila stays behind and gets married. And we really see the changes in their lives happen. And it's a lot about like who's supported and who's not and how that changes your whole life. Oh my God. I can't even praise this book enough. It's almost hard to talk about because I just want to tell you to read it and then we can talk about it after. But this is just such a fantastic book, and I think it really elevates the first story, and I think it really leads you into the third story, which might be my favorite, or I might think it's the best. I don't know. I have to think about it. They're all one story, so it's like, it's hard. This is really where it will hook you. So if the first one didn't get you, continue. This one will get you right away. Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay is completely brilliant. It's messy. Our characters sort of change where they're at, whereas one was more successful in this area, the other then sort of takes that spot where one was more successful in relationships, the other falters. Like, they sort of flip around, and this is where it becomes really political. There's a lot of talk about communism, post-war Italy, economics, class, unions. It really paints a picture of like an unstable country and the forces that are sort of fighting for control and how it affected everyone. I loved this book so dearly, and I think this is where it really sort of like dug in, and I was just stunned every single step of the way. I was really frustrated by a lot of the characters in this one as well, but so real. Like, you sometimes make choices that are not right, and you have to live with them. So that's a lot about what this book is about. Our stunning finale, The Story of a Lost Child. When I finished this book, I sat in silence for like 10 minutes and then I cried because you are living with these characters for so long. This is a story of them in old age, and it's heart-shattering. The way that these characters' lives end up and the twists and turns and how they got there is so astounding. Astounding. I don't want to say too much because it's the last in the series, and like, you have to read to get here, but you have to like earn it. But I loved it. Stunning conclusion, no notes, perfect book. So those are some of my favorite books that I read last year, my top 10, and I think they're pretty indicative of like my taste overall. I like to read all sorts of books. Certain books stand out to me more than others, obviously, but if you have read any of those books and you loved them, let me hear it. I want to know what your favorite book was that you read in 2024 and what you're reading in 2025. I have a whole list. I'm going to talk about it, and thank you so much for listening. This is my first video, and so I'm really excited to be able to put this out here and talk about things that I love. So thanks for sticking around.